Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. And today, I'm delighted and honored to have with me Dr. Thomas J. Webster, who's a globally recognized pioneer in nanomedicine and biomaterials, with a prolific research career spanning decades and multiple institutions. He's translated groundbreaking discoveries into life-changing medical products. He's the founding editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Nanomedicine. His work on AI-driven implantable sensors is at the forefront of the field, and his numerous awards, including a Nobel Prize nomination in 2023, underscores his immense impact. The topic of discussion today is going to be nanotechnology and nanomedicine, the future of healthcare. So, Doctor, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. I was watching one of your podcast episodes, and you say that the healthcare is failing. Why do you think or say that our healthcare is failing, and how do you suggest we can correct our current healthcare system?
Yes, thank you for having me. First of all, it sounds kind of harsh to say that, but I do believe if we just look at one metric, and that one metric is what's happening to the average global life expectancy. And unfortunately, that number is going down. So our average as a globe, as the Earth, our average life expectancy is actually decreasing. So, of course, many people will point to COVID and say it must be because of COVID that life expectancy is decreasing. But if you actually look at some countries, like the United States, where I am right now, some countries in Europe, the average life expectancy was actually decreasing before COVID. So I think if we look at healthcare, and the purpose we set up healthcare systems is, of course, not only to extend the quantity of life, but also the quality of life. If that's not happening, then I think we have to be bold. We have to make these somewhat harsh statements so that people realize everything we've set up, it might have worked for 100 years to increase life expectancy, but it's not working anymore. So we need a paradigm shift. And I firmly believe that if you look all across our healthcare system, no matter what country you're in, we have inherent problems. And just to highlight a couple, we have a hospital-based healthcare system, which is very old-fashioned. I mean, we saw the problems of this in COVID, where people had to wait in lines just to see if they had COVID and to get treatment for COVID. We have this brick and mortar type buildings that are serving as the central location for healthcare that's old-fashioned, right? We can do a much better job of bringing healthcare to everybody, no matter where they are. If they're geographically not close to a hospital, if economically they can't afford good quality healthcare, I mean, we can do so much better than having a building or series of buildings that represent a hospital. I also think another big problem in our healthcare system is we tend to think that pharmaceutical agents cure everything. If you go into one of these old-fashioned hospitals and say you have a fever or a cough, you'll get some kind of medication. And that's our approach. Give you a drug if you have a problem. And we have seen problems with that approach. We have antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We have chemotherapeutic-resistant cancer cells. We have side effects from these drugs. In the United States, we have a huge problem with an opioid addiction, and those opioids often are prescribed at the beginning of a healthcare problem. So our solution to give you a drug and get out of the hospital, go home, get better, that's flawed in my opinion. And there's so many more, I think, problems in our healthcare system that need a fresh look. We really have to take a step back, reanalyze how we do everything in healthcare, be much more personalized, give technology a sense in healthcare in terms of having at-home healthcare wherever you are. If we're ever going to see this reversal of a declining global average age, life expectancy.
Right, right. So, Doctor, I mean, at least the data which has been provided, I mean, through the years, is that the average global life expectancy is lengthening rather than shortening. So maybe I would want you to kind of elaborate on that. There is so much that can be done because you are maybe talking about a complete new paradigm of approach with hospital. I mean, move out of hospital-based healthcare systems. Because I personally have been invested in virtual reality, metaverse, and yes, I see so much opportunity that with virtual healthcare, you will be able to make healthcare more accessible to everyone. So maybe I would want you to kind of talk about why do you is there any data that supports that the average life expectancy is going down? And maybe elaborate on this personalized medicine or this going away from a brick and mortar approach. How do we kind of get over there?
Absolutely. And to the first part of the question, what does the data say, right, is a great question, because I think a lot of policymakers, federal funding agencies, the World Health Organization, we all make decisions based on data, right? So, and many times we're unsure whether this data is even accurate or not, and we don't pay attention too much to how is the data collected, who is collecting it, is it accurate? So the studies that I have seen, which really highlight post-COVID life expectancy decreasing, can be questioned. It certainly can be questioned. How was it collected? Are we collecting data from all over the earth? Or are we only collecting data from highly industrialized nations? And therefore, we're getting a skewed approach, right? I think another big part to this data collection is the reason people are dying, right? When you die, of course, the clinicians have to attribute that to some cause. Many times it's a multiple cause, and it only gets attributed to one, right? We had this problem with COVID, where I believe, and a lot of people speculate, were we attributing too many deaths to COVID rather than other underlying health problems? So I think you're absolutely correct, and we need to do a better job at looking at data, not just face value of what that data is saying, but how is it collected and how can we use it? But putting that issue aside, and again, the studies I have seen showing that life expectancy is decreasing, putting those issues aside, I think it is clear to see in many aspects of healthcare, we can do better. And we can accelerate disease diagnosis, we can accelerate disease treatment, and some good things came out of COVID that are addressing these issues, right? The at-home test for COVID. That is wonderful. And we need to be doing that for every disease or every problem that we have, so that somebody in the ease of their home can determine, do they have a disease? Do they need further help? Telemedicine, as you're mentioning, wonderful advancement that accelerated during COVID, where you can speak to a healthcare professional like we're speaking right now. What a wonderful way to increase access to healthcare. So these things are helping. I don't know why we weren't doing them before COVID because we had the technology, but I think also to push this even further, there's a device that I have right here, right? This is my iPhone, my cell phone. This is revolutionizing medicine. So probably a lot of your listeners know you can put a temperature sensor on a cell phone now. You can scan somebody to see if they have a fever. People are also using those temperature sensors to look at infection. When you have a local infection, the temperature goes up. When you have inflammation, your local temperature goes up. So you now have these connections you can put on your personalized device and really determine your own health in ways that we're just beginning to explore. One of the things that's amazing to me also that technology is providing is you can also put an ultrasound on your cell phone, an ultrasound. I mean, that's just amazing to me every time that I think about it, because, of course, people think about using an ultrasound if you're pregnant and analyze the growth of your child. But also ultrasound can be used in orthopedic injuries to look at tendon tears or ligament tears. So the fact that we have technology that fits on this device, and then you can incorporate things like artificial intelligence to predict if these infections will become health problems for you, or will your body be able to handle it. It's digital healthcare is really going to change our whole mantra of needing to go into a hospital and needing to have a face-to-face meeting with a clinician. And I think all of that is exciting as long as we do it right, right? There are issues with some of these at-home technology devices, including, health security, data storage. All those things are issues. But I think, again, we have an example where technology is really pushing us to be more personalized, give more information to you about your health, and give more information to your doctor about your health.
Right, right. Yeah. So I think, we're entering a fantastic world where we'll possibly have to maybe let go of the past and look at the new world, because, the digital healthcare could completely revolutionize, I mean, not just the healthcare, the entire ecosystem, with virtual reality. I mean, you don't really need to go to a school. My son studies in a virtual school.
Yeah.
And how fantastic is that idea or a thought where you don't have to step out from your home and maybe take a bus and then travel to the school, which takes possibly an hour in traffic. And then, you're for a couple of hours, you're at the school, or, an evening, you take the bus back again, which takes maybe an hour. Then there's your carbon footprint over there. Here he's in a virtual school, which is first of its kind in India. And that, instead of you going to the school, it brings the school to you. And the same thing can happen in healthcare or work. I'm not saying that, we need to look at the entire, we need to go completely virtual, but, I think we need to somehow understand the potential of these technologies and find the right marriage. So we take those little bits and pieces and upend our healthcare. There are, like you pointed out, we have like a computer in a pocket, which is your phone. And, you can add your sensors, ultrasound, and there's so much things that you could do. It also has cameras. And there was just recently, I think I was just reading about this AI startup, which does your tongue scanning, and with the tongue scanner, it can kind of predict that, okay, this person has a certain set of diseases or not, is disease free. So I think we're getting into a fantastic world, and what needs to be taken. I mean, what needs is maybe for us to maybe somehow move from a reactive way of doing healthcare to completely proactive. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When you think of any other field, right? What other fields only fix a problem once there is a problem, right? I drive over a bridge every day to work. Thankfully, that bridge, there's preventative measures that are taken to make sure that bridge is safe. In healthcare, we've set it up completely the opposite. Right? We have annual checkups, definitely, annual visits to your physician, definitely. But for the most part, you don't get concerned about your health until you feel pain or until something is not functioning the way it should. And that's when you start getting help. So you're absolutely correct that we have to be more proactive, because if you're always chasing your tail, you have increased cost, you have inefficiencies in the system. You have basically a problem that you're always trying to treat something rather than getting ahead of the curve. And I would also mention, I love your story about your son going to a virtual school. So I teach a virtual course at Brown University on nanotechnology. And one of the issues, and I've been teaching this for about 6 or 7 years, one of the issues that first came up is, well, you can't do experiments virtually. You can. I have students in my course virtually who are making nanoparticles at home, right? If you take honey and microwave it, you can make carbon nanoparticles. So the thought that you can't do experiments virtually is not true either. And that's one of the main criticisms against virtual learning. But we're able to reach corners of this earth with this program and getting people excited about nanotechnology, about medicine, about health in ways that were previously unthought of because we're using a virtual mode to do it.
True, true. And it kind of democratizes knowledge. I mean, there could be a student from any part of the world. I mean, leveraging your knowledge. I mean, learning from the best in the world. I mean, you're not restricted to your localized, bunch of doctors or professors. So I think how cool if we kind of, move into that world. You spoke about nanotechnology. Will be great if you kind of explain what nanotechnology is, what nanomedicine is. And when we talking about nanotechnology, how small are we talking about?
Yeah, well, very, very small. But we usually, in the courses I teach, one of the things we often do is we take Mentos. So Mentos are these, for if you're not familiar, are these little candies, right, that freshen your breath. And if you take one Mento, that we often think of as a conventional material. If we take that Mento and break it up into dozen or more little pieces, we call that nano Mento. When you add Mentos to soda, they bubble, right? There's a chemical reaction that occurs and you get the foam, the suds, the bubbling of that soda. When you add the one Mento compared to the many smaller pieces of the same Mento, you get a different reaction. So it reacts differently with soda. That, to me, is the definition of nanotechnology. It's taking the same material. You're not changing chemistry. You're not changing anything. You're just making it smaller. And you get a different reaction by doing so. It's a size-dependent property, right? And it's been around for a while. In fact, Richard Feynman, we often consider as maybe the great-grandfather now of nanotechnology. When I started, he was the grandfather, but maybe now the great-grandfather of nanotechnology. He was telling stories back at universities in California about building nanomaterials one atom at a time, right? Take an oxygen, take a nitrogen, put them together one by one and get special properties from doing that. And we're still chasing his dream that was developed many, many years ago. So to turn this into a practical experience, one of the things I did for my PhD in the 1990s was simply acknowledge that our bodies are composed of nanomaterials naturally. If you take a piece of bone and you look under a microscope, an electron microscope, very high power microscope, you will see little tiny nanoparticles. So our simple question, my simple hypothesis was, if we know that bone is made up of nanoparticles, why aren't we implanting nanoparticles? Wouldn't a hip implant, a knee implant, an ankle implant, wouldn't it grow more bone, be more successful if it was made out of the same particles that bone itself is made out of? And that's what we did. We showed that if you made an implant, an orthopedic implant out of nanoparticles, then you can increase bone growth. In fact, 25 years later, I spun that technology out into a company when I was a professor at Purdue University. That company now is selling spinal implants that have nanomaterials in them. And we've implanted these into 34,000 patients as of last week, and none have failed. None of them have become infected. None of them have loosened. None of them have led to what's called inflammation or scar tissue growth around the implant. And that's important because the average failure rate of a traditional spinal implant is about 5 to 10%. So knock on wood, hopefully we've eliminated implant failure by using these nanoparticles, by using nanotechnology. And now we can go and look at other implants that are used in the body, vascular stents, pacemakers, the plethora of other medical devices. Let's use nanotechnology in those, and maybe we can also eliminate failure of these implants. So it's been an incredible journey, and it really started with that one simple acknowledgement that we are walking nanomaterials. So let's use nanomaterials across medicine, and maybe, just maybe, we can have better healthcare as a consequence.
Congratulations to you and your team for the 34,000 successful implants. You mentioned about bone as well as spinal, and now you want to move on to vascular stents and so on and so forth. What's the process when you say that you are implanting leveraging nanoparticles? It will be great if you can kind of talk about that as well as, like, I mean, your future roadmap, when you talk about what other areas you see this nanoparticles being helpful in the healthcare ecosystem.
Absolutely. So there are many ways that you can make, or you can incorporate nanotechnology into a medical device, right? You can have coatings on those medical devices that incorporate nanoparticles. You can do processes like anodization. So anodization is electrochemistry, and it's actually why your silverware is shiny, right? And metal pieces are shiny is they've been polished, so to speak, to have a nanotexture. And that is called anodization, a process that's used. So there are, dozens of different ways to incorporate nanotechnology into implants. And what's fascinating to me is when I look at not only what we've done, but other people in this area, we're all seeing the same thing, no matter how we incorporate nanotechnology into our implants. So whether we're using coatings or anodization or other maybe more sophisticated processes, we're all seeing this ability to reduce infection, improve bone growth or tissue growth, reduce inflammation. So again, that highlights to me nanotechnology, a size-dependent process where if you create a surface to have these nanotextures that are similar to the natural tissue in the body, great, that's continuing. I think when contemplating the future, there's a lot going on in terms of nanoparticles. In fact, we've been remotely involved in this, but a lot of other groups have been pushing this forward. The COVID vaccine, sold by Moderna and Pfizer, that uses a nanoparticle. So we even have examples in COVID where nanotechnology has helped us get out of the depths, of COVID. So there's also nanoparticles being used to go through the blood-brain barrier. Earlier today, I gave a presentation at a conference of how we're creating nanoparticles that can fight brain infections. And one of the problems is getting the drugs through these tiny pores in your blood-brain barrier. So these small particles can get through the blood-brain barrier and treat those problems. I think so. In nanoparticle drug delivery, I think is a huge continual up and coming area. I think another area that we are very interested in, and it ties into digital health, are sensors, implantable sensors. So we're learning a lot from external devices like we talked about, but let's start growing sensors off of implants. And we have a startup company that is doing this for orthopedics. So it's growing carbon nanotubes off of the surface of an orthopedic implant. And those carbon nanotubes can electrically identify whether a bacteria has attached, MRSA, or whether a bone cell has attached and bone is growing. And then it can send that information to your handheld device to tell you at any moment in time, your implant is doing wonderful, keep up the physical therapy, continue to walk and get exercise and have a good diet. Or unfortunately, we've identified 100 bacteria on the surface of your implant. We've already scheduled a visit with your clinician to see what we can do about reducing that number of bacteria. So implantable sensors are a huge part of the future of medicine. I think 10, 20 years ago, people thought it was science fiction, but having these intelligent materials that can communicate with you about your health and your doctor about your health from the inside is really another thing that I think is going to revolutionize medicine in the years ahead.
I hope that this moves from the lab to the market. How cool it would be if these nano sensors, implantable nano sensors, would kind of give you the entire information of your body. That would be super cool. But I would want you to, maybe elaborate on the brain infection side. And also, there was something that I read that, you are leveraging nanotextures to kill tumors. So maybe you could talk about nanotextures to kill tumors and brain infection. Maybe talk about that, because I think the human brain is so complicated. These neurological disorders are really, really terrible. And how do you think nanotechnology, nanomedicines, nanosensors can help over there? And what's the timelines you genuinely see that these interventions could really help in treatment?
Yeah. So it's a great question about timeline, right? So even in our case of the spinal implants that I talked about, so I started that company in 2005, and we just started inserting those nanotextured spinal implants around 2018. So even something as, and I don't mean to belittle the research, but something as static as a spinal implant, it's not moving. There's no sensor. It's a standard implant that only has changes in surface roughness, surface textures. That took, 13 years, 12 years to get it through the US FDA, to find surgeons who would implant it, so it's a long process, especially when you're talking about nanoparticles, delivering them through the brain to fight a brain infection. That's a long process to get through regulatory agencies because, and rightly so, they want to know, and the community wants to know, well, what if a nanoparticle does not go into the brain, but instead it goes to the liver, or it goes to the kidney, or God forbid, it goes to the heart? Are you going to start seeing adverse effects of your nanoparticle on these other organs? So you have to be very careful about doing studies, designing these materials that only go where they're intended to go. But the promise is enormous, right? And again, we briefly talked about antibiotic resistant bacteria, right? And again, this is something our conventional healthcare system created, right? We would not have some of these antibiotic resistant bacteria like MRSA, methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or other drug resistant bacteria if we never created those drugs to kill them in the first place. So these bacteria are infecting the brain and other areas of the body. I firmly believe we need non-antibiotic approaches to kill bacteria. And one of the things that can work are nanoparticles. So nanoparticles can do a number of things to bacteria. They can clog the membrane of the bacteria, or the outer part of a bacteria. And by clogging it, the waste that the bacteria naturally produces does not go external to the bacteria. Nutrients do not come in to the bacteria. So you've stopped that bacteria from functioning. We also know from studies that nanoparticles can enter bacteria. And if they enter bacteria, they can release what's called reactive oxygen species. So free radicals of oxygen, which can kill the bacteria. So there's all kinds of mechanisms that nanoparticles can kill bacteria without using an antibiotic. And I think this is incredibly promising in an area that we need to research more, because if we can get these particles through tiny pores in the blood-brain barrier, get them inside bacteria in the brain, we can kill them without generating an antibiotic-resistant strain or without causing a new type of bacteria. So the nanoparticle area, I think, is really fascinating. Another thing that is wonderful and progressing are magnetic nanoparticles or photothermal nanoparticles. These are particles that can respond to an external stimuli. So if you have a certain part of your brain, let's say you have an infection right here in your brain, and you inject the particles over here, you can concentrate a magnetic field to get all those particles to go specifically to the infection. And that can kill the bacteria. Photothermal properties is where you can use things like near infrared to excite these nanoparticles to heat up, right? This was first discovered in cancer, where cancer cells are more susceptible to increases of heat than healthy cells. So if you have a nanoparticle that can heat up on demand, you can now kill a cancer cell without killing healthy cells, which is something chemotherapeutics can't do, right? Chemotherapeutics kill everything. And that's part of the problem with that drug-based approach. So there's all kinds of great, I think, externally controlled and externally stimulated nanoparticles that are also helping in medicine. The other thing you mentioned was the nanotexturing for killing cancer. And this is something we discovered maybe a decade or so ago. And this is where the membrane properties, flexibility of the cancer cell come into play. So what we are seeing is that if you have nanotextures, and you can think of these as kind of like a bed of nails. So an implant surface with all these tiny little nano nails on them. What we have seen is cancer cells, the membrane is too stiff to fit into all of those contours. So a cancer cell does not attach as well to a nanotextured surface as a healthy cell does. A healthy cell's membrane is much more fluid, much more flexible. It can fit into all the crevices, all the features that you create, but a cancer cell does not. And if the cancer cell does not attach to your implant surface, then it won't attach, and it needs to attach to live, right? We call these anchorage dependent cells. They have to attach to something to live. So if they don't attach to your implant, then they die. And that's one of the things we've been proposing to use, for example, in bone cancer. If you have a tumor in your femur, osteosarcoma, and that tumor is removed, and you have to put in an implant to substitute for all that bone that you just removed, we are proposing to use nanotextures to keep the cancer from growing back, to keep it from, if you don't get all the cancer cells or the cancer spreads there from somewhere else, you're going to have the same problem again if your implant surface does not kill those cancer cells. So we have seen putting nanotextures on those implants, inserting them where a bone cancer once was, tumor once was, can keep cancer from coming back. And that's a big advantage to a lot of these patients who are receiving implants after having tumors removed.
It's sounding so exciting that you can stimulate these nanoparticles externally. How cool is that? I mean, the potential would be humongous. And you mentioned, there are obviously, these regulatory FDA roadblocks, but I'm sure that in another a few years, maybe these would change, and maybe that the entire lab to market hospital would get accelerated.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you
yeah.
can, I would say too that the regulatory agencies do have mechanisms for acceleration of approval if you're targeting high risk diseases. And brain infection, brain tumors, they are high risk diseases, right? There aren't many treatments that work. So they're high risk. So it is certainly possible that these nanotechnologies for the brain, for other high risk diseases, could be accelerated and not take that 13 years that it took us to get a spinal implant approved.
Right. You're the founding editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Nanomedicine. So what
Yes.
trends have you observed in nanomedicine in recent years that has caught your attention, and you really are laying your bets on them?
Yeah, I think recently it has to be AI. Artificial intelligence And in many aspects, AI started with a very negative reputation, right? Students were using AI to write their term papers. There was a lot of negativity about AI. But now people have figured out how to use AI to create better implants, to tailor an implant surface based on somebody's immune system, right? If your immune system is weak or you're older and your immune system isn't as good, then you need a much more proactive implant surface, or you need much more proactive medicine than somebody who's younger or who has a better immune system. So AI is really helping to identify how well a certain treatment will do in a patient before you even do that treatment. And that, I think, is really promising, where in the future, and just think about it, right? If I fall down and break my hip, I'll get the same implant that an 80-year-old grandmother will get if she has, God forbid, bone cancer, right? We have two separate reasons for needing a hip implant, but we'll get the same exact one. And that makes no sense, right? AI can help us determine, well, what implant would function best for me and what implant will function best for her. And let's use that implant. So personalizing it, tailoring it. And I think the advances in computer algorithms and what AI has accomplished is really pushing that personalized medicine. So it kind of all fits together, at least in my brain, of novel materials, proactive materials, responsive materials, artificial intelligence to choose what are those best materials, digital health to gather information after treatment has started and then tailor that treatment depending on what the results are. That is really the vision of the future of medicine. Not, I have pain, I go to a hospital, I get an implant, same standard implant that everybody else gets. I see the doctor a week later, and then I only report back if I have future pain. That approach is not proactive. And as we've mentioned, I don't think that approach is really working in our healthcare system. But one other area we haven't talked at all about that I'm seeing a lot in terms of publications, conference presentations, startup companies, is the use of environmentally friendly biomaterials. It's funny because I think medicine often gets a pass at harming the environment, because we often say, well, our first priority is to help human health, right? That's number one. We have to do everything we can to help human health. And if we're harming the environment in the process, that's just part of the price you have to pay. But people have turned the page, and I think rightfully so. There have been studies, the plastic island in the Pacific Ocean, where I think like 10%, I read a study that 10% of that plastic island is composed of catheters, medical devices. So we clearly have our medical products that are getting out into the environment and causing a problem. So people are looking at natural materials, recyclable materials. Even in my own lab, right, I'm guilty. The petri dishes that I use, the pipettes that I use, all of these things are made of plastics that are not recycled, and of course, we're growing organisms in these. So we have to throw them away into these orange biohazard bags. They get heated up to kill all the organisms and then thrown into a landfill. That's a permanent now part of harming the environment. So I think this work that many groups are doing to try to develop environmentally friendly materials to be used in testing of new implants as new implants, I think we will continue to see a real strong uptick, and I wouldn't be surprised. Many of us rely on funding, of course, from federal funding agencies to do this research. I wouldn't be surprised if in not too soon that those federal funding agencies will require people to use recyclable petri dishes, recyclable 12-well plates, recyclable pipettes in their testing. I think the technology is there, the knowledge is there, and the demand that we can both help human health and not harm the environment is strong enough that I hope we see that happening pretty soon.
Right. True. True. Yes. I hope that the support system becomes more concrete and, pushes the entrepreneurs, researchers such as yourself to, take these things from the lab to the market. Now, we spoke about obviously the good sides about nanotechnology, nanomedicine, and then there is obviously the downsides. And that is with every specific, every technology. Now, technology per se is never good or bad. It's always how you end up using them. It's the humans, the direction they kind of take the technology. Artificial intelligence is not bad. Nanomedicine or nanotechnology is not bad. It's if it gets into a certain sector, people who want to use it in a certain way, to create something bad out of it. Then what are the dangers, of downsides of nanotechnology? Because there's Eric Drexler who's written a book and he talks about these Grey Goo. So maybe you could talk about Grey Goo and the downsides of nanotechnology and nanomedicine.
Yeah, it's fun. I think the Grey Goo type comments, I think, are more of the unknown, which, like you're saying, any new technology has unknowns, right? So we have to figure it out, right? We have to do research and we have to answer the unknowns. I think the biggest issue that nanotechnology faces, it's not the nanotextured surfaces. I think that's safe, they're effective, they're easy to make. I think it's the nanoparticle area. So it's the toxicity concerns, right? And I think we all acknowledge everything is toxic. At some concentration, you can die from anything, right? Water. You can drink too much water and not from drowning, but your cells become hypotonic, right? And the cells can die from too much water. So I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about toxicity, it's concentration dependent. So we have to find out and do more research on toxicity of nanoparticles to cells. And this is, again, we talked about this before, intended directional applications versus unintended nanoparticle location, right? So you're using nanoparticles to fight brain cancer, but nanoparticles end up in the heart. We have to figure out what is the toxic effect of that nanoparticle to cells in the heart and elsewhere. But it's also, I would say, environmental toxicity too, right? So there are concerns. We make tons of nanoparticles every day, and there's bound to be some nanoparticles that get into the environment. What effect do they have? If an insect eats a nanoparticle and then a spider eats the insect, and then something else eats the spider, does that nanoparticle go through that chain? Is it modified? What really happens in terms of that toxicity of that particle? So I think toxicity is we're learning more and more every day about not only are nanoparticles toxic and at what concentration, but how do we make them less toxic while keeping their attractive properties? I think that's an important question. I think the other one, in an odd way, a criticism of nanoparticles is we completed a study recently, and some other groups are seeing the same things, that bacteria are developing a resistance to silver nanoparticles. So even though we spend, and I made the argument, right, that we need to use non-antibiotic approaches because bacteria develop a resistance to antibiotics. Well, is the same thing happening with nanoparticles? And we have seen that some bacteria are developing genetic changes when exposed to silver nanoparticles, and those silver nanoparticles are becoming less effective. So are we just going down the same pathway that antibiotics drove us down for resistance of bacteria? So we have to figure that out, right? And if that's true, then how do we make silver nanoparticles or other nanoparticles effective at killing infections, killing bacteria without resulting in resistance? So those are, I think, some of the, and not only to get back to the toxicity of nanoparticles, but also manufacturing. When people are making nanoparticles, what harm is occurring to the worker who's making, do we have effective safety protocols in place when making nanoparticles and even studying them in the lab. I think that's the biggest potential downfall of nanotechnology is really toxicity.
Really, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. My last question to you: what's your moonshot? You're part of some startup and a lab. What comes next for your startup and your lab? And paint a picture what the world is going to look like maybe by the end of this decade when all of these becomes a reality.
Yeah, so my moonshot is I alluded to it a little bit ago. Sensors, implantable sensors. The information that we can get from implanting nanomaterials and using them as sensors to monitor everything in your body. Your protein levels. One of the things that we're also developing sensors for is we've all had a blood test, right? You go in for your annual physical, you get a blood test. That blood test counts the number of red blood cells, white blood cells, all these other cells that are important in your immune system. It does not determine the activity of those cells, right? You could clearly have very few white blood cells, but if they're very active, then you're healthy. But if you have few white blood cells and they're very inactive, that's a problem. So sensors, implantable sensors, in real time, we believe, can actually detect the number of white blood cells and other cells in your blood and their activity. And I think that that's critical. So to me, having implantable sensors fits into the future of healthcare. I don't think it'll happen in 10 years, but I think maybe 50 years, 100 years, hospitals will be right here. This is your hospital. And you won't have to go in to see a doctor. You'll still have a real person, not an AI doctor, but a real person who can help you and diagnose your problems. But this device will communicate to implantables, sensors in your body, not only to determine if you have a disease, but if you do have an alteration in your health, this device will help you treat what the problem is before it becomes a larger problem. That, to me, I think, is where we get the best healthcare. It's personal. It can occur anywhere that the patient is, anywhere that you are. You can get more health care. You take control over your own health more by having these kinds of personalized healthcare systems. So I hope nanotechnology or all these technologies are pushing us into this more personalized, effective healthcare system.
Doctor, thank you for taking time and being part of the podcast. I hope this distant future that you spoke about comes accelerated closer to us. I think, because what a world would that be where we have these sensors which reads up our entire body and transitions us from a reactive to a proactive healthcare, a precision medicine space. So wish you and people such as yourself more power to possibly bring that, maybe that 50-year, what you said, to maybe a little bit closer, so we can make the healthcare a little better. So thank you. Really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. And until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you, Doctor. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.